Hello, this is Spencer Lyon, and in this video, we will continue studying the field of graph theory or network science. And today, we will focus on how there may be edges or ties between nodes of varying strength. Before viewing this lecture, we will assume that you have viewed our introduction to graphs. The outcomes or goals for today will be to understand the concept of a triangle in a graph or network and be able to recognize whether a triangle is open or closed. We're going to learn about a theoretical concept called triadic closure, and we will use that to be able to identify what are known as global and local bridges in a network. We'll focus on some visual intuitions for how to recognize a bridge, and then we'll get into some programs that will allow us to do that programmatically. We'll understand the phenomenon known as the quote strength of weak ties. And finally, we will study the idea of centrality, and we will use a specific form of centrality known as betweenness centrality to understand what it means to partition a graph. The primary reference for this material is the third chapter of the Easley and Kleinberg textbook. So let's start with a very interesting research question that was put forward in the 1960s by a PhD student named Mark Granovetter. Mark was considering how people get a new job, and he wanted to understand what types of relationships led to the finding of a new job. So, what he did was he interviewed many people who had recently changed firms or companies, and he asked them how they found their new position. Unsurprisingly, most people said that they got their new job through their own social network. They got referrals or at least learned about the job opportunity through their own personal contacts. However, the surprising piece of his research was that most people said that the key contact that led them to their job was actually from their group of acquaintances and not from their group of friends. And the distinction here is a little bit subjective, but the idea is in each of our social circles, we may have our close friends that we do activities with or we spend extra time outside of work or other obligations. And then we also have a group of acquaintances. These may be coworkers, classmates, professors, etc. People who we know and are familiar and friendly with, but who wouldn't be considered a close friend. And the main finding that Granovetter found was that most new job referrals or learning opportunities for somebody seeking a job came through the acquaintances within their social networks and not necessarily their close friends. What we're going to try to do in this lecture is build up some intuitions for why this may happen. And we'll try to explain this phenomenon using a graph and some key metrics that we can compute about a graph. So, as we work through today's lecture, keep in mind this main question that Granovetter studied, which is why do people tend to get job referrals or new jobs through acquaintances more often than they do through close friends? So, as I just mentioned, in order to answer Granovetter's question, we will study some new concepts in graph theory. And as we'll see today, this is one of the many possible settings or examples for which we can use a graph to study the flow of information. You might be thinking, and it would be a good exercise to pause for a moment and think what other examples there might be. As you do this, maybe think about where you get your information. It could be from social media, it could be from a news website, it could be from some online forum, or maybe from a newspaper or magazine. And as you think through all the places where you get information or learn about new things or opportunities, you can start to think about how you might categorize the type of information you're getting. And you might think about whether you get a certain type of information from a certain type of source. Maybe you get your celebrity gossip and news from social media, where you get your updates on your work expectations from an internal memo or newsletter sent within your company. So you might be thinking, well, why do I get different sources of information from different places? As we consider the flow of information and all the forms that might take, we want to make one key point. And what we'll say is that by studying the information as it flows through a graph, we're taking something that is inherently interpersonal, or relating one person to another, and may even carry some emotional components where we have friends sharing ideas or thoughts or feelings. Uh, and we're going to analyze this very human phenomenon of sharing information in a mechanical or structural way. By representing social interactions and relationships using nodes and edges that make up a graph or network, we apply this structural perspective to the way people communicate with one another. And so we want you to kind of keep these ideas in mind again as we're studying today, because underlying these graphs that we'll be drawing, uh, there may be emotionally charged kind of under the surface features that may lead to certain results. And we'll be building up some theoretical tools, and even some technical ones today. And then at the very end, we'll go back to Granovetter's question about how new jobs are found. Let's spend a few minutes now talking about the structure of a triangle within a graph. Now, often when we do network science or graph theory, we sometimes like to look at the large or the aggregate, and think about how the overall outcomes may be impacted by the structure of the graph. And other times we like to zoom in and look at the small or the micro. This is a case where we want to zoom in and look at the small. So when we consider looking at, say, a small number of nodes, we could look at a single node and try to analyze its edges and relationships. We could also look at a pair of nodes, and that would help us understand how one node is either connected or not to another. But the types of analyses we can do with only one or two nodes is somewhat limited. So then, if we start to think about additional nodes beyond just one or two, we get to collections of three nodes, which we'll call triangle. So, triangle is made up of three nodes and exactly two or three edges that connect them. And we'll kind of draw a few triangles here. Suppose we have these three nodes. I won't label them, but suppose that they're here and we have edges that connect these two nodes. Now, this would be called an open triangle because there is kind of an open area, if you will, or a place where we're missing edge in our triangle. So if we have exactly two edges between three nodes, we're going to call that an open triangle. Now, on the other hand, suppose we have three nodes in our triangle, and we also have three edges. In this case, we would say this is a completely closed triangle. There's not any entry point into the set of three nodes. It's all closed off. So set of three nodes with exactly three edges between them would be called a closed triangle. And it turns out that understanding one, how to identify a triangle, and two, whether it's open or closed, can be a building block for a lot of pretty impressive analysis we might do later on. So let's now shift gears for a moment and look at some code. We're going to load up the graphs package as well as the graph plot package. Oops, let me fix this. Let me make sure it's set up for me. All right, so I was able to get that package running by writing this cell here, import pkg, and then pkg.add graph plot. So now if I come back down here, I try to load these packages, they load up just fine. So now we're going to create our graph. We're going to use a function that's built into the graphs.jl package called star graph. And we're going to end up with the following. So here we have exactly 5 nodes in our graph. The first 4 are connected in a star pattern. Because of the randomness of how this was plotted, they didn't look like a star at first. Let me see if we can make it look more like a star. That's not a very good one. We try one more time and then we'll just move on. Okay, so this is a little bit closer to a star. So what we have here is node A, kind of the central node or the hub here, and it is connected to all of nodes B, C, and D. Then we've got node E way over here, kind of hanging out by itself. And to make this a little easier, I'm about to draw on this, we're going to add back our layout structure. So now we can see pretty clearly each of the 5 nodes here. Now there are exactly 3 triangles amongst these 5 nodes. And the triangles include the following. We have triangles for, we have a DAC triangle, we have a CAB triangle, and we also have a DAB triangle. And when I write them in this way, what I mean is first one, we'll kind of note it in purple. It starts here at D, it moves to A, and then it goes to C. So we're just following the edges from D to A and then from A to C. Now, each of these 3 triangles is open because there are exactly 2 edges involved in each of the triangles. So if we were to add some edges, suppose we added an edge here, or maybe another edge between C and B, or even an edge between D and B, then the corresponding triangle where the edge was added would become closed. Notice that this node hanging out over here, node E, because it has no edges coming either in or out of it, it doesn't actually participate in any triangles. And in order to have it participate, it would need to be connected. Say, if I drew a node or an edge between nodes D and E, it would now be part of an open triangle between D, E, and A. But to start off with, when E had no edges, it was not part of any triangle. Let's now apply a little bit of context to the idea of triangles in a network. Suppose the graph that we just constructed represents students arriving at their first year of college. In our example, each node in the graph will represent one student. Each edge represents a friendship or a connection between the students. We might have a story such as the following to describe the graph we just saw. We'll say that A is going to an out of school state, but just happened to know B, C, and D from their summer camps or family friend relationships, or perhaps maybe one of them even went to the same high school and is also going to an out of state college. We will say, though, that in our story, none of B, C, and D know one another. And finally, node E is a student from a foreign country and who is coming without knowing any other students upon arrival. With this question in mind, or with this story in mind, we'll ask the following question. Given only this information, would you assume or think that it's more likely that nodes B and E become friends or nodes B and C? So remember, we have A in the middle, and A is connected to B, C, and D through various, existing relationships. And then we have out here on its own, we have node E. So now what we're asking in this question is, given what you know about social interactions, would you assume that the blue edge is more likely to form or the purple edge? And why would you suggest? Just a question to keep in mind as we carry on. Now that we understand a bit more about closing triangles, let's see how we can do this using the graphs.jl package. To begin, we're going to make a copy of our G1 graph so that in this next line of code, where we call add edge exclamation point, and we pass a graph, we're not actually going to make changes to G1. We're only going to be modifying a copy of that, which is G2. Now, the edge that we'd like to add will be between nodes 2 and 3. And this is going to be the triangle formed by nodes A, B, and C. So node A is integer 1, B is 2, and C is 3. So when we add an edge between 2, 3, we're really adding an edge between B and C. And what we should see now is that we have a closed triangle between A, B, and C. There is overwhelming empirical evidence to support the intuition that when there are edges between, say, nodes A and B, as well as A and C, it is likely that an edge between B and C will form. Going back to the question we posed a minute ago, that means that the empirical evidence would suggest that it's more likely that an edge forms between B and C than an edge forming between B and E. Now, this feels intuitive if we apply the social network context to our graph. If A is a common friend between B and C, it's likely that via social gatherings or other events, that B and C may tend to cross paths because they have a common friend in A. And because of this common friend, we say that B and C, it's likely that they end up forming some sort of relationship, which would be represented by an edge between their nodes. However, when we think about B and E, they don't have any common friends or any common edges. And so it's less likely, especially in a social setting, to think that B and E would become friends. They just don't know the same people. So the opportunities for them to socialize are lower than people who have common friends. This intuition that edges are likely to be formed when we have shared neighbors is known as triadic closure. Now, the name comes from the idea of closing a triangle. So, for this reason, when we analyze social network data, it's really common that you end up seeing a lot of triangle shapes. It's more likely that you'll see a triangle than that you'll see a bunch of random one to one connections without closing that loop. Now, As triangles are a fundamental building block for doing graph analysis and network science, it makes sense that there would be support for working with triangles in graphs.jl. And thankfully for us, there is very good support here. And there are two key functions that we will find ourselves using to work with the triangles of a graph. These two functions are called triangles, and the second one would be local cluster. So the triangles function is going to return an array of integers. Now let's take a look at what this may look like. Here, what we're going to do, we're going to @show the value of triangles for the first graph, and then @show triangles for the second graph, where we added that edge between nodes B and C. And what we get back here is a 5-element array, one element for each of the nodes in our array, in our graph. And the value here is going to be the number of closed triangles for which that node is involved. So if you remember, in our original graph, we had 5 nodes, there were 3 triangles, but all the triangles were open. So when we ask graphs.jl to tell us about the triangles in this graph, it's going to say 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, because each of the 5 nodes have no closed triangle. And if we wanted to look a little bit deeper at which element these correspond to, this would be node A, B, C, D, and E. So now when we consider the second call to the triangles function where we're passing G2, because we added the edge between B and C, we closed off that triangle, we now see that all of A, B, and C are part of one closed triangle, whereas D and E are still not part of any closed triangle. Now, the local clustering function will actually return a tuple of two things. First, it's going to return exactly what we just saw. So it's going to return the number of closed triangles for each node. But the second thing is going to return the total number of open triangles or possible triangles for each node. So here's how we interpret it. We've already talked about the first element of each of these return tuples. This is counting closed triangle. The second element is new. The way we read it, again, if we were to put labels on them, we would see that the first element corresponds to A, then B, C. And what this is telling us is that in either of the two graphs, A is part of 3 triangles. You remember, A was part of a triangle with node B and C. It was part of one with B and D, and it was part of a third triangle with C and D. And the reason why we have only one triangle as possible for, say, B, C, and D is a little bit puzzling at first. So let's draw out the graph for G2, and we can talk about why. We have A, B, C, and D. Just label these here, A, B, C, and D. And then our edges now, we have a complete triangle with A, B, and C. And then we have open triangles between A, C, D, as well as A, B, D. Now, you might look at this and say, okay, well, B is part of a triangle with A, B, C. So that would be 1. Then you could look at a second triangle, BAD. That looks like another one, so you might count 2. And then you can also think about, or those are the 2 you might think about. But we don't count this one in pink here. And the reason for it, the way that the counting works, is it just counts the triangles for which the node has the two edges. So let me see if I can draw this a little bit different. I'm going to forget node E. Let's just put it way out here. Not connected to anything. So we've got D, we've got C, we've got D. B, C, D, and we've got this edge here. If we look, the only triangle for which there are two edges from B is this triangle ABC. And so that's why we have a 1 right here. Same thing with C. If we try to look at, okay, which possible triangles are there between where there are two edges coming out of C, there's only this one with ABC, so we get a 1 there. Then if we look over at node D, way over here, and we try to think, are there any triangles that have two edges with D? And the answer is no. There's only one edge ever coming out of D, so it still has a 0. So even though you can count from A's perspective, CAD as an open triangle, you can't count it from D's perspective because it only has one edge out of the possible 3, whereas A has two edges for those possible. In addition to counting closed triangles and potential triangles, there's another concept that we sometimes talk about, which is known as the global or the clustering coefficient. So often it's very helpful to have a single number that describes how open or how closed are the triangles in a graph or the triangles for a specific node. Now, when the functions we just saw, we didn't get a single number to summarize that. From the node perspective, we had a pair of numbers, which is possible triangles and closed triangles. But from the graph perspective, we ended up with 10 different numbers. We ended up having a number of closed and open triangles at each node. There is another statistic we can compute called the clustering coefficient. And the purpose of the clustering coefficient is to tell us the fraction of triangles in a graph that are closed. Now, there's two versions of this clustering coefficient. There's a local version, where we think about the fraction of triangles that are closed at a specific node. And there's also a global version, where we think about all of the triangles for our graph. Let's take a quick look using G2, which has that one closed triangle, as our graph. Let's look at both of these variables. So when we call local clustering coefficient and we pass it G2, we see that for node A, 1/3 of its triangles are closed. For nodes B and C, 100% or all of their triangles are closed. And then D and E are not even part of triangles, so they have a 0% closed triangle. This lines up very well with what we just saw on the previous slide about from this local clustering. Really what we got back was we got back the first array element-wise divided by the second array. Now when we turn to the global clustering coefficient, things get a little bit more interesting. And so here's how we compute the 0.6 here. We recognize 0.6 as 3 over 5. And so let's see where that comes from. So we're going to write 0 over 6 is equal to 3 over 5. And if you remember, we had the following sets of arrays. We had 1, 1, 1, 0, 0 for the number of closed triangles for each. And then we had a 3, 1, 1, 0, 0 as the number of open or possible. So this is going to be possible. This is closed. And if we sum up this array, we get back 3. And if we sum up that array, we get back 5. And then we're just going to divide those two. So really what this is it's the sum of closed for node I across all I over the sum of over all nodes, the possible triangles at node I. It's not quite a mean, not the average, say, of these three numbers, but rather it's the dividing or the ratio of these two sums. And that's what we call the global clustering coefficient. It is a single number that represents how open or closed the graph is. As the number of as this number rises, the global clustering coefficient, what that means is that a higher fraction or ratio of the possible triangles in the graph are actually closed. I encourage you, we're not going to take the time to do this here in our video, but I would encourage you to look here at these 4 example graphs that I've created for you and try to count how many open triangles and closed triangles there are in each of these graphs. It's a great exercise to see if your intuitions on some of these small graphs are accurate. So I encourage you, if you're viewing this video, maybe pause it at this point, look through these 4 graphs, and try to count the total number of closed triangles, the total number of possible triangles. Then you can do a quick computation to get that global clustering coefficient and then compare. Is your calculation going to match the calculation done by graphs.jl? Let's now talk about another key graph theory topic known as a bridge. And to help us understand how this works, we're going to construct for ourselves a specific graph known as the barbell graph. And the reason for that is, if you've ever seen a dumbbell or set of weights, and you can imagine that there's a handle somewhere here in the middle, and that these clusters on either side are the actual weight on the end. This looks like a dumbbell or a barbell. And when we pass 4 comma 4 here, what that's doing is it's letting us control how many elements are on the left cluster and in the right cluster. If I change this 4 to, say, an 8, we would have a single cluster over here with 4 nodes, and then another cluster with 8. But for our case, let's just stick with 4 by 4. Now, I want to point out here how not all of these nodes are playing the same role in the graph. For example, notice that, let's pay attention to node 3 right here. Now, it has a total of 4 edges. It's connected to all of nodes 0, 1, 2, and 4. But not all of these edges are the same. So, in particular, we can kind of think about the edge between 2, 3, 0, 3, and 1, 3 as being fairly similar. It's all part of these closed triangles being 3 and then all of 0, 1, and 2. However, this edge over here, the edge between 3 and 4, is somehow different than the other edges that we've been looking at. Another key difference here between these 3 edges I've marked in gray and this red one are that the edges in gray connect 3 to 0, 1, and 2, but these are already connected to one another. There is an existing edge between 0, 1, 0, 2, and 1, 2. That's not true for node 4. There's no edge between 1, 4, 2, 4, or 0, 4. Kind of keep that in mind as we continue to analyze or think about this graph. So this special edge 3, 4 is, in graph theory terms, known as a bridge. And the more precise definition of a bridge is an edge that if we remove the bridge, it would cause all the nodes involved to be in separate components of our graph. So let's take a look at what this would be visually. So we're going to make a copy of our barbell graph here. We'll call the copy G4. And then we'll use this rem edge exclamation point function to remove from G4 the edge between 4 and 5. Now, the 4, 5 here, I was labeling them as 3, 4 because I started counting from 0 in this example. But remember, Julia starts counting at 1, so that's why we call it 4, 5. Now, if we plot this G4 function, we see here that we have two completely separate components. We have 0, 1, 2, 3, and then we have 4, 5, 6, 7. And as separate components, what that means is that there are no edges between any member of component 0, 1, 2, 3 and any member of second component 4, 5, 6. So that edge 3, 4 that we had was very crucial in somehow preserving a connection between, say, 0, 1, and 2 and the other components from component number 2, 6, 7, or 5, 6, and 7. So we have talked before about the notion or property of triadic closure. And in the context of this barbell graph, what that means is because there is an existing edge between 3 and 4, it's fairly likely that another edge will form between 4 and one of three's other neighbors, which we labeled 2, 1, and 0. So if the triadic closure property is as common as we've said it is, it would be very likely that at least one of these three edges between, say, 4 and one of these other nodes is likely to form. So that's an argument that would tell us that it's probably unlikely that we observe a bridge in some real world data set. If triadic closure is a common phenomenon in real world data, and triadic closure would basically eliminate the existence of bridges because it would close off some triangles, then it's not likely that we'll find bridges somewhere out in the wild. Suppose that we did end up at a case where none of these edges formed. For some reason, 4 is unwilling to connect with either 2, 1, or 0. Even in that scenario, where 3, 4 might still be a bridge, it's entirely possible that this 3, 4 we've been looking at is this barbell is actually just a subset of a much larger graph. So here we have a graph containing our original nodes 0 through 7. That's what we'll find right here. But maybe if we collected more data or zoomed out a little bit, we'd realize that the barbell we were looking at was actually part of a larger graph that I've circled here in purple. And now we delete the edge between 3 and 4. It will not separate 4, 5, 6, 7 into a component that's completely separate from 0, 1, 2, 3. Because now, if we wanted to go, say, from 0 to 7, there's a path. We can go 0, 8, 10, then 12, 12, 7. So just by gathering more data, we've now realized that what we thought was a bridge is not actually a bridge. So we've just argued that in a case where we just have the dumbbell or the barbell graph, edge 3, 4 is really special. It is a bridge, and therefore we may want to pay extra attention to it. But then we've also just argued that things like a bridge don't really come up very often in real data sets. For example, we might just zoom out and realize that 3,4 is not a bridge at all. It's just a subset of a much larger graph. So why then would we say, one, bridges are super important, let's pay attention to them, and then two, they don't ever really show up, so don't worry too much. That seems a little contradictory. So graph theorists have proposed a slightly less stringent definition of an edge like 3,4. That's not quite a bridge, but what they call a local bridge. And here's what it means. So even if we were to break that edge 3,4, and in our larger graph, so thinking back to this larger graph here, suppose we delete this edge from 3 and 4. Well, there's still a single component in our graph, meaning we can reach one from any node, we can reach all other nodes. However, there's still a change or a difference. And suppose we wanted to go again from 0 to 7. Well, before we delete our edge 3,4, we've got a pretty quick path 0, 3, 3, 4, 3, 7. We've got a distance between 7 and 0 is equal to 3. But if we delete this edge and don't allow for that path, we've got to go around. We have to go somewhere like this. And now our distance has increased. Distance between 7 and 0 is to 4. And so when we remove local bridges from our network, what happens is the distance between some nodes in our graph actually goes up. And that's still a useful and interesting property, even if it's not quite as strong as completely separated components, which is what we would get from a bridge. When we have that property, instead of calling it a bridge, we call it a local bridge. And we'll say here that any edge from some node A to B is a local bridge if A and B have no common neighbor. Now, if we think about it, if we have a case like 3 and 4, these have no common neighbors, or in other words, all triangles involving both 3 and 4 are open. If we think about 3, 4, 12, well, that's open because it's missing an edge. Or 3, 4, 5, open because it's missing an edge. And so in order for a single edge to be a local bridge, it means that all triangles that it's a part of are open triangles. Or that the two kind of partner edges or partner nodes along that edge have no other edges. So our discussion about triangles and bridges so far has been confined to relatively small graphs that we can inspect visually and kind of hold in our mind all at once. But most quote, real world graphs are far too large for us to do that. They contain too many nodes and too many edges that it would be difficult, if not impossible, for us to keep track of all of it. So in order to analyze a larger graph, we're going to need to build up some computational tools or functions. And so that's what we'll work on right now. So to begin, we want to have a function called num shared neighbors that works as follows. We can read the doc string here, and it says num shared neighbors of a graph where we have node 1 and node 2 does the following. Given a graph G and node indexes n1 and n2, compute how many neighbors n1 and n2 have in common. Now, I've written this function for you, and here's how I chose to implement it. So I say that the number of shared neighbors between n1 and n2 is going to be the set of all neighbors of n1 union with the set of all neighbors of n2, and then we're just going to count the length of that. Now, if you don't know a lot of set theory, here's how it might work. Often when we're doing math, we write sets using these curly braces. So maybe I have a set here, 0, 1, and 2, containing these three elements. And then I have a second set here containing 2 and 3. I'm going to call this set A and this set B. And if I do A union, that's what this N stands for, A union B, this is going to say, what is the set of all elements that appear in both A and B? So in our case, the only element that appears in both of these sets is going to be the number 2. And for that reason, that would be the union of A and B. So that's kind of what this little operator does. And the function set here, it constructs a Julia set that behaves very much like a mathematical set. So if we get all the unique neighbors of n1, all the neighbors of n2, we find the union, meaning which nodes in this set of neighbors also appears in this set of neighbors. Now we have some shared neighbors, and then we can compute the length of that set, which tells us how many elements are in it. So that's my implementation of that first routine. So I'm going to run that, and we can do our test code here, and we see that these tests all pass. So now that we have a function to compute the number of shared neighbors, we can actually use it as a building block or another function to determine all the local bridges in a graph. So here's what it looks like. Here's the docstring, local bridges G. Given a graph G, find all local bridges in the graph. So here's just some boilerplate or some starter code for you. And I'm not going to implement this myself. I'm going to leave this as an exercise for the viewer. But I have given you this starter code, and I even have some hints. So here's how the starter code works. Out is going to be an array, and then we're just going to say that this needs to be an array of integers, and this is going to be list of all nodes that are part of a local bridge. And actually, that's not quite what I have. It's going to be a tuple in int. This is a list of all edges that are local bridges. The first hint says determine what to loop over for an n to a second node. Hint, think about the definition of local bridge. It has to do with neighbors. Then we're going to call number of shared neighbors between n1 and n2. And then the third one, if we find that the number of shared neighbors is 0, we're going to call push out n1 and 2. And notice I have a little helper here. This is going to help you avoid double counting because we're working with undirected graphs here. We're just going to retain a strict ordering that in this array of tuples, we just have n1 always less than n2. Otherwise, we would double count the local bridge 3, 4 and 4, 3. We don't want that. So I'll leave this for you. There's a little test function here. to help you verify if you get it correct or not. But we'll move on and we'll look at how we can maybe look at a real world example of a graph. So here I'm going to load up somewhat large graph here. This is coming from Twitter, and we have here 1.3 million nodes in our graph and 81,000 edges. Oh, excuse me, the other way around. 81,000 nodes and then 1.3 million edges. And each node here represents a user on the Twitter or X platform. And each of these edges will form if one user follows another. Now, clearly, a graph with 81,000 nodes and over a million edges is far too big for us to do a comprehensive analysis using only visual techniques. So we're going to need to rely on some of these statistics we've been learning about. So I'm going to look at the global clustering coefficient for the Twitter graph and let this run for a moment. It tells us that 17% of the triangles in our graph are closed. All right. What about when we list all the bridges? Okay, so here telling us that we have 4,900 or 49, yeah, 4,900 bridges, which represents only 3.72% of the total edges in our graph. So less than 1% of edges form a bridge. And that gives you some sense of how rare true bridges are, or even local bridges are. So what I used the built-in bridges function from the graphs.jl package. And if we look at what that function does, it says compute the bridges of a connected graph and return an array containing all of them. And so if we ask, let's just take a look at what this function does. Bridges of, let's do gplot v4 or g3. Here's our dumbbell or barbell graph. If we look for bridges of this, it could tell us that we have a bridge between the fourth and fifth edge. Great, we do. Now, if we look at G4, for example, there are no bridges now of G4. And to remind ourselves what that looks like, we'll do a G plot. Here we've separated them. There are no bridges. We look at G5. Here we've got our dumbbell as a subset of a larger graph. We look at the bridges of this one. There again are no bridges. So this function is kind of built in, and it tells us how many true bridges there are. Let me correct that wording here. And it would be very interesting, and I encourage you to look at how many local bridges there are using the function that you just created here. Compare that to the number of actual bridges. The final comment I will make on this example is we only have a small subset of Twitter. We only have 81,000 of its users, where in reality, we know there are millions upon millions of them. And so it's likely that maybe if we included more nodes and edges, that some of these bridges would actually turn out not to be bridges. So that's definitely a possibility here with this data set. So far, our discussion about nodes and edges have been limited, or has been limited, to the case where we say two nodes are either connected via an edge or not. We have not yet discussed the strength of these connections. So we're going to extend our discussion to include the notion of whether an edge is a strong edge or representing a strong tie, or if it's weak. In our friendship example that we worked on before, strong ties would represent good friends or friends, and weak ties would represent acquaintances. And this will help us speak to the analysis that was done on the job finding phenomenon by Granovetter. So in the figure below, we have a representation of a graph similar to G5, where now, instead of only including the edges, we also have labeled each edge with either an S, which represents a strong tie, or a W, which represents a weak tie. So this is that same graph we were working with. The portion down here, this is the dumbbell part, where we would have labeled these edges as 3 and 4. And then we did have that brief example of how this may not really be a bridge if we consider the wider context, include this upper component here. So what we have is this representation of whether edges are strong or weak. And this is actually going to help us further the idea of closing a triangle or triadic closure. So let's extend that intuition that friends of friends are likely to meet and become friends to the case where we have labels whether ties are strong or weak. Now remember, triadic closure said that if we have a link between A and B, as well as A and C, it's likely that an edge between B and C will form. We will now bring in the strength of the edges and say that if A and B and A and C are both strong edges, then it is even more likely that BC will form than the case where either AB or AC was a weak edge. More formally speaking, we have what's known as the strong triadic closure property. And it's kind of defined in the negative. So we'll say that a node A violates the strong triadic closure property if there exists two nodes B and C to which A has a strong connection to both, and there is no edge at all, either weak or strong, between B and C. We say then that A satisfies the strong triadic closure property as long as it doesn't violate. So, given our definition of the strong triadic closure property, we can make the following claim. And we'll refer you to section 3.2 of the textbook for a proof. Here's the claim. If a node A in a network satisfies the strong triadic closure property and is involved in at least two strong ties, then any local bridge it must be involved in has to be a weak tie. Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. So suppose that A and B form some sort of local bridge, and it satisfies strong triadic closure, meaning that if there are strong connections between A and let's label these D and E. If these are strong here, triadic closure would require that these edges all exist. Now, what this graph or figure is showing is that if A and B are our proposed local bridge, if they have a strong connection here, then it's not possible to be a local bridge because A is connected to C via a strong edge, and it's connected to B via a strong edge. And our strong triadic closure property says that this edge has to exist because A has a strong edge to both C and B. So if this is the case, then AB, or if A does satisfy strong triadic closure, then the CB edge must exist. However, if we say that this connection, instead of being strong, is weak, then we'll say that this edge does not need to exist, and then therefore it's possible for AB to be a local bridge. So that's just what this property said. If A satisfies strong triadic closure and has at least two strong ties, here we have strong from C to A and then A to B, or A to D, A to C, and so on, then any local bridge it is involved in must be a weak tie. So, in order for AB to be a local bridge, the tie has to be weak. Otherwise, there would be a shared neighbor between A and B because of strong triadic closure. So, go ahead and pause the video and think through that for a minute if you need to. And this is figure 3.6 from the textbook, so there's surrounding context there. But the idea is having strong ties to both B and C and satisfying triadic closure means that the edge CB definitely exists, and now AB is no longer a local bridge because there's another path, this edge CB. So now let's go back to where we started and think about the Granovetter question, which was why do people report finding jobs through acquaintances, which again we've labeled as weak ties, more often than their close friends, which would be strong ties? Well, the answer is in that strong triadic closure property. Here's the story we might tell. Suppose that node A lost its job. And if it asks for a referral from C, D, or E, uh, let's draw the graph again to make sure we have the context. So we have A here and C, D, and E. One second, let me clearly draw this. So we have A, and then suppose we have D, D, and E, who are all friends with each other. So these edges between C, D, and E they all exist. If A were to go to D and ask for help finding a new job, because they're part of the same kind of tight knit social structure, and remember, these are all strong connections, it's likely that any information D has is going to overlap significantly with any information that C could give. Same thing about E. So if A goes to C, D, or E, it's likely that they will learn about, or that A will learn about pretty much the same information. However, if we jump across this local bridge, across the weak tie over here to B, B has access to another network, including F, G, and H. And maybe there's somebody in this network, F, G, or H, that can give a positive lead for A's new job. So by asking B, who's just a weak tie or an acquaintance, the information set of A increases significantly. We are now getting information from a variety of different players that we never would have gotten information from had we stuck only with strong ties to D, C, and E. The summary of this argument is that local bridges are, by definition of strong triadic closure, weak ties. And it is exactly these weak ties that give you access to new parts of the network. Okay, here we go. So we can see it on their diagram. These ties to D, C, and E are all strong, and they're all connected to each other. So if we ask any of them for information, we're going to get pretty much the same subset of information. But if we cross this local bridge, talk to B, he's got strong ties with a whole new set of information that we just couldn't have gotten because D, E, and C were not really connected to them. So it's this link, this connection, that brings A the most new information. It brings A the most new potential job offerings or referrals. And this is the feature that Granovetter undercovered or discovered in his research. Now let's continue on this idea of how many networks, especially social networks, consist of some tightly knit regions of common friends, and then maybe some weak ties that serve as local bridges to connect them. If we have this type of structure, there is an important kind of class of algorithms that have been studied and discovered that do what's called partition our graph. And when we partition a graph, what we mean is that we break it down into the tightly knit components. So we kind of identify where these weak connections are that bridge two tightly knit groups, and we think about severing those weak connections so we have completely independent components. When a graph is partitioned in this way, it's broken down into components that we call regions. So let's consider this example. We have here four kind of clusters, if you will, of common friends. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 10, 11, and 12, 13, 14. We then have kind of 7, who's related to or has connections with 3 and 6. So, in some sense, 7 is the local bridge between 1, 2, 3 and 4, 5, 6. Furthermore, 8 acts as a node providing local bridges between 9, 10, 11, and 12, 13, 14. So that's if we looked at this left and right. We could further make the comment or observation that the edge between 7 and 8 is not just a local bridge, but a bridge where it connects the entire left half of our graph, nodes 1 through 6, to the entire right half, nodes 9 through 13, 9 through 14. So if we were to try to partition this graph, what we would first do is we'd probably break this edge, and then that gives us a nice clean separation left and right. Then we might consider breaking these two edges. So now we have 7 kind of in an island all by himself. And then we have a separation between 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6. And at the same time, we would do the mirrored severing of links here, separate these. So now we have a nice separation between 9, 10, 11, and 12, 13, 14. So these circles kind of show you where these regions would come if you were to sever these local bridges. We'll go ahead and create a graph here using graphs.jl. And as we'll see, this is the Julia representation of that graph we've been working with. So we're going to call it G6, and we'll refer to that here down below. Turns out there are two classes of algorithms that can be used to partition a graph. The first class of algorithm is known as a divisive algorithm. And what we do here is we partition the graph by removing local bridges, also known as spanning links in the literature, which will break down the network into large chunks. And each time, in each step, when we remove another local bridge, the chunk size gets a little bit smaller. And that's what we saw with our example before. Or when we first broke the connection between 7 and 8, we had two chunks, each of size 7. And then when we broke the links between 7 and then 6 and 3, it broke us into 3 chunks. These regions had 3 components, and then 7 was by itself. So that's a divisive algorithm. We start severing ties or severing edges and see where the graph structure remains intact. The alternative family of algorithm is known as an agglomerative algorithm. And here what you do is you start with a single node, and then you construct regions kind of bottom up by iteratively finding nodes that are highly connected to other nodes in the region. This type of algorithm is very powerful, but is a bit more abstract. And so for our studies today, we're going to choose to focus on the divisive algorithm. In order to build a divisive algorithm for graph partitioning, we first need to define a key metric that will tell us how, quote, central a node is in a network. And we'll provide a brief introduction to this metric here, but we suggest that you look at chapter 3.6 of that Easley and Kleinberg text for more detail. Let's first establish some notation. We're going to say that capital V represents the set of all nodes, and that S, T, and V are three elements from that set of nodes. We'll then say that sigma ST represents the number of shortest paths between S and T. In order to compute sigma ST, we first need to find the distance between S and T, which again is defined as the shortest possible path length between S and T. And then, so we'll have the distance in hand, and then we'll just count how many possible distinct paths that connect S and T have a length equal to that distance. Then we will define sigma st here now as a function of v, which will represent the number of shortest paths between S and T that happen to pass through the node V. Then what we'll do is we will define the betweenness centrality for a particular node V, which will give notation CBV. And we'll say that this is equal to, 1 second, let's fix that typo. The betweenness centrality for a node V is defined as the sum for all nodes S not equal to V not equal to T of that number of paths passing from S to T that go through V divided by the total number of shortest paths between S and T. So what we're doing is we are going to be counting for all possible pairs of nodes S and T. Let's keep track of how many shortest paths there are, and then how many of those happen to pass through the node of interest V. We'll compute that fraction, and then we'll move on to a different pair of nodes, S and T. Conceptually, what this betweenness centrality is capturing is how much information would have to flow past a particular node in our graph if we were to construct some random path or a path between two random nodes in our graph. So there are various algorithms that we could code up that will let us compute this betweenness centrality. But for right now, we'll just let network X do the hard work for us. So inside of the network X library, there's a method or a function called betweenness centrality. And we just have to pass it our graph G6. And what you'll see here, if you remember the graph, we had, let's go back and take a quick peek at it. So G6 was this graph where we already made the comment that nodes 7 and 8 were a local bridge connecting the left and right halves of our grid, of our network. So keeping that in mind, we'll see that the betweenness centrality score for nodes 7 and 8 is higher than all the other nodes. The next most significant nodes were 3, 6, and then 9, 10, 9, 12. These were the ones that were connected to 7 and 8 and that allowed paths to be constructed either between the triad of nodes 3, 10, 9, 10, 11, or 12, 13, 14. So these nodes have the second highest score for betweenness centrality. And you can think about why intuitively. So remember, what we're trying to do with our betweenness centrality computation is say, given node 7, its betweenness centrality captures of all possible pairs of nodes, let's pick, say, 9 and 2, how many of the shortest paths between 9 and 2 have to go through 7? In this case, they all do. And that would be true for any node over here on this left half. If we started at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and we ended at any of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the shortest paths have to go through this edge right here between 7 and 8. That's why the betweenness centrality score is so high for this edge between 7 and 8. Because it's the only edge by which these 7 nodes right here, these 7 nodes are connected to these 7 nodes only because of this edge right here. The next set of nodes that had the highest score included 9, 12, 3, and 6. And here's the reason why. If you want to move from any of these 3 nodes and find a path to any of those 3, you have to cross through the edge 6, 7 and the edge 3, 7. So there are a lot of shortest paths that are forced to take this route. But there are fewer of those than there are crossing this, simply because we're only matching pools of 3 and 3 instead of, when we considered the edge 7, 8, we were matching pools of 7, 7. All the other nodes, so anything in these kind of outer clusters, has a score of 0. There are no shortest paths between any 2 nodes in the graph that have to cross, say, the edge 6, 7, 6, 4, or 6, 5. Excuse me, 6, 7 was, but no shortest paths have to go through 6, 4, or 6, 5, or 5, 4. So our intuition about which edges are really significant in order to form paths between different sets of nodes is made concrete or quantitative by this betweenness centrality measure. So now that we have a measure of how central a node is or how much information has to pass through it, we're ready to talk through an algorithm for how we might partition a graph. So we're not going to go into detail and implement this algorithm here, but we'll refer you to section 3.6 of that textbook for more details on how it works. But here are the main highlights of the Girvan-Newman algorithm for graph partitioning. The inputs to this algorithm, the input is a node, or a graph, excuse me, not a node. And the output are a list of edges to delete at each step. So the first step of the algorithm, we want to find all nodes with the highest betweenness centrality and remove all the edges that these nodes participate in. Now, once we have this divided graph, after removing nodes with high betweenness centrality, as well as all edges they participate in, the next step is to compute the betweenness centrality for all of these regions or all of these subgraphs that resulted from the deletions we did in step 1. Now that we have these new betweenness centrality measures, what we'll do is remove all nodes and corresponding edges with the highest betweenness centrality. Again, we'll keep track of which edges we needed to delete, and we will continue with this procedure where we first compute between centrality, and then remove nodes with the highest between centrality. And we'll continue to do this until all the edges in our graph have been removed. And this will give us the output will be which edges needed to be deleted in step 0, step 1, step 2, and so on in order to completely isolate each node in the graph. This list of edges that was deleted at each step is our theme for partitioning the graph. Let's summarize the key ideas we learned about in this lecture. First, triangles are a key structure in networks. They are the smallest possible structure that can be studied of a collection of more than two nodes. We learned that closed triangles are very common in social networks because of the property of triadic closure. If A is friends with both B and C, it's likely that B and C will eventually meet and become either friends or enemies, but in some way become connected. We also learned that social networks are often constructed of some tightly knit regions of mutual friends, and these tightly knit regions are maybe bound together with some weak ties. These weak ties are crucial in the network because they often serve as a local bridge and therefore are central in the terms of betweenness centrality for flow, maybe of information or other things from between nodes in our network. And this betweenness centrality measure really captures the idea of how essential or crucial or central a particular node is in connecting regions of a graph. And again, another way to think about this is how much information on average has to flow past a particular node in order to be sent from arbitrary nodes. So these were the key ideas from this particular lecture, and we'll continue to build upon these, especially how strong or weak ties are different and play different roles as we continue studying graphs in future lectures.